We most certainly live in an age of virtue signaling. Now, virtue signaling has always been around. It's basically when you try to show that you are a good and worthwhile person by doing something that is expected of you by the masses, or by large numbers of people, or by society at large. And many people do this on a regular basis. What I want to talk about today has less to do with virtue signaling and more to do with individual qualities and traits, which is to say, I want to talk about individuals. I want to talk about us as people. And one of the more counterintuitive aspects of human psychology is the baseline assumption that many of us have about ourselves that we are quote-unquote good people. Now, of course, there might be some exceptions to this. There might be actual psychopaths who are aware of their psychopathy and therefore know that they are deviant, but nonetheless don't care. And so they might say, well, I'm not a good person, but I don't care because I'm going to do what I'm going to do regardless. But most people, most neurotypical people, especially normies, will just say, look, I'm definitely an okay person. I'm a decent person. But the problem with this is when people talk about their virtues and their inherent goodness, or alleged goodness, to put it in a better way, they're really only looking at themselves under a magnifying glass in a very limited context. And that is fundamentally the problem and the hindrance here that prevents us from gaining a greater understanding of ourselves as individuals and by extension human psychology. So let me give you a couple of examples of people who are quote-unquote good people, but then again, not so good people. A very simple example, right, is an example of a conversation I was listening in on between a guy and some other person, and the guy was complaining about having to work in an office. Well, so far, nothing special. But the person he shared his particular room with in this office had Tourette's syndrome and some other strange, atypical neurological tics. And this would lead the guy to behave in a very, let's be perfectly honest here, irritating and annoying way. He would make sounds all the time, but of course he didn't have control of it. And of course, for a while, his colleague, his co-worker, granted him the understanding that one would assume would have to be there because this person is not in charge of his strange tics and other weird gestures and sounds that he makes. But apparently it got to the point where it was just too much for him. And the normal guy sharing the office with the Tourette's plus other tics guy basically blew his lid, despite the fact that he was aware of this other person not being in a position to control himself. He blew his top. He knew it was quote-unquote wrong, but he did it anyway, because the sounds this guy was making were so persistent and so annoying, it drove him absolutely batty. A more historical example, and perhaps a more sinister one, is the example of participants in National Socialism who were just having a jolly good old time not too far away from a concentration camp where people are being murdered and worked to death. And you'd think that these people would be very grim and what have you, but behold the photo, which I'm using as the thumbnail for the video, and these are these very same people who are having a good time with each other, playing music, smiling, laughing, probably going on picnics, whilst not too far away from them, some pretty heinous things are happening. And they all thought to themselves, I'm sure, that they were decent people, right? So you might be beginning to understand my point here. And in German historical writing, there's this term Mitläufer, literally somebody who runs along with, right? But Mitläufer in German terminology, these days especially, is specifically used to depict people who essentially went along with the National Socialist movement, and sometimes it's also used to describe the kind of indifference a person has and the willingness to go along with things simply because it is the path of least resistance. And it's always an interesting thought experiment to propose, not just during this time, in particular the time of World War II and National Socialism, but more broadly, the idea of the potential that each and every one of us is a Mitläufer of sorts, right? And I think we actually can see this very much on display depending on what the event is. And there are all kinds of reasons why someone might be a Mitläufer or not. But the reality I'm trying to drive home here is that we might have delusions and conceits about ourselves as individuals as good people. But I can assure you that you're not, and I'm certainly not. And I can tell you why. Although I've never committed a crime, and I've never inflicted violence upon anybody, apart from a few times when I was assaulted and I was fighting for my life, I have raised my voice to individuals. And In some cases, I behaved rather disgustingly, almost invariably as a response to provocation. And so in one instance, I remember with an ex-girlfriend who was just, effectively speaking, a lunatic. At least she had her moments of lunacy, and she was doing everything in her power, whether by intention or not, to push my buttons, and I completely blew my top, and I called her all sorts of unpleasant things. Now, you'd think that's not exactly how a quote-unquote good or decent person acts, but nonetheless, I was pushed in that direction. So there's a cause and effect there. But the point I'm trying to drive home here again is that we typically have this very static, circumstantial view of ourselves that is in turn bound to a specific set of circumstances. The set of general circumstances that people look at are the circumstances that one could describe as the circumstances of equilibrium. So the general state of being an individual is in. Not a state of euphoria, not in a horrible state, but rather that state in which a person could describe the other person as that is the way that person is. The problem is that we are not one self. In fact, you can make an argument there is no self. It's a separate video and a separate discussion. Nonetheless, we have different moments that can be heavily influenced by the environment we find ourselves in, as I have been in the past, when I completely lost my temper and called this ex all sorts of unpleasant things because weeks and weeks of fighting and being driven absolutely nuts pushed me to those limits. Nonetheless, that too, that aspect of the foul-tempered Stardust who lost his temper and called this ex-girlfriend all sorts of nasty things, well, that was me too. Normally, I never say anything like that, as I'm a pretty calm, mellow person, as a rule. That's the state of equilibrium I'm in. But push me in one direction, right? I recently had, for example, an excruciatingly painful medical procedure performed on me, and I can honestly say I've never felt pain like that in my life, and understandably, it put me in an utterly foul mood. So, you could say, well, these are exceptions, right? This is not how you normally are. But normally is not the total description of who we are as individuals. And so I've seen myself engage in good acts and bad acts, as I've mentioned. And again, the point I'm trying to make here is that when we see ourselves across the whole span of different circumstances, we simply don't know if we are quote-unquote good or decent people. There are plenty of people, again, because it's such a convenient example, who were living during the time of National Socialist Germany who thought they were perfectly fine and okay and decent people, even though by today's standards they might be judged otherwise. And so I think it's a bad move on the part of people to describe themselves as decent or good, because if that circumstantial equilibrium is never challenged by highly differentiated circumstances that could at least potentially draw out the evil, if you will, or the ill in you, then what does it really mean that you're a good person? You're a good person when things are going well, and when things aren't going well, you're a foul person. You're a hateful person. You're a terrible person, whatever it might be. And part of this is a trick of psychology, because most of us are invested in preserving our egos. So you hear people say, I'm really responsible. I hold myself and others to account, blah, 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 blah. What would that same individual who's doing quite well do in a circumstance where he was starving to death, or he was facing enormous political pressure, like the citizens of Germany, say, in the 1930s and 40s? How would he act then? He has no idea how he would act. It's all just a show based on a limited perspective and even more limited circumstances. More broadly speaking, as pertains to the greater culture, and say the culture wars, you see these people basking in their own self-righteousness, whether it's virtue signaling or not, when in reality they simply don't know how they would act under duress or circumstances that were vastly different. Nobody really knows that. It's all just a hypothetical. It's a thought experiment at best. And over time I've developed a certain respect for people who are just honest about how they think they would act in a way that isn't totally delusional. And so, for example, years ago, I worked in a warehouse, and one of my German colleagues, we were talking about history and what have you. He was the only person with a brain there, and so he was the only person I could really communicate with. Everyone else was just talking about boinking and football, i.e. soccer for Americans. Well, we got to talking. We're talking about, again, the sort of concept of sort of Mitläufer, right? Mitläufertum, I already brought that up. And he said, yeah, I would have been a Mitläufer. It sounded like a good deal. You get your pension, you have your children taken care of, you have work, you have security, blah, blah, blah. And so he said, that's why I would have just gone along with it, whatever the greater moral consequences, because it would have been really convenient. But he also emphasized that he wouldn't be doing it for reasons of hatred or what have you, but rather he just would have gone along with this huge political apparatus because it was the convenient and practical thing to do, which is, in many cases, is why people went along with it to begin with. It's a separate discussion. Nonetheless, that's a kind of honesty and introspection, I think, that I can respect a lot more than people who pound their chests about how responsible and virtuous they are, when that responsibility and virtue has never been put to the test by anything remotely challenging that. Now, does this potentially mean that we're all bad people? Well, yes. But it doesn't just mean that. We're also good people. We are the sum total of our behavior and ourselves in all the circumstances we exist in. And so there are bad versions of Stardust. There are good versions of Stardust. There are middle-of-the-road versions of Stardust. And there probably is, although I shudder to think of it, an absolutely foul, horrific, and evil version of myself, which, God forbid, never comes to fruition, because I know not what the circumstance would be that would provoke such a thing in me. Nonetheless, it's something I'm acutely aware of, that we all have this certain potential for not being a quote-unquote good person. And again, it's really easy, particularly in this virtue signaling culture we live in lives of comfort and wealth, to proclaim how good they are to the world. We're only as good as our behavior is in the worst of circumstances we face. And so I think that's something to think about and dwell upon for a little bit. We are all these things, but lest you fall prey to the delusion that you are uniquely good or virtuous or responsible, well, think about potential circumstances and think how you might really act, and you might be surprised about yourself and who you actually are. Anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in. Please hit the bell icon to be informed of my videos. Fight the good fight against YouTube for my sake. I will be forever grateful. Subscribe if you're not yet a subscriber. Share the video, comment, like, all that YouTube jazz. And if I'm still alive, I will check you out later. May the gods watch over you. Enjoy your weekend. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.